your opinion of the campaign to bomb Raqqa? Now, clearly striking at Islamic State, but there's a danger that this could backfire, I would think.
Well, I think it was a politically expedient and necessary thing to do for François Hollande. I think François Hollande is under a lot of pressure right now to prove that he's capable of handling this situation. And striking out at Raqqa, it doesn't harm his image.
So he's saying basically, you've hit us in Paris, we're going to hit you in your capital.
It's a vengeful act, and I don't think that too many politicos in France are going to be against it.
I'm worried that, I mean, sorry to interrupt you, I'm worried that while we've had the terrorists striking at Paris indiscriminately, when you go and carpet bomb Raqqa, that's just as indiscriminate, isn't it? It makes
of course
France
it is,
as bad as the terrorists, doesn't it?
I'm not going to go that far to say that France is as bad as the terrorists, but I think what it does do is it's similar to the bombing of Baghdad when we invaded Baghdad, during the Iraq War. You're killing a lot of people that shouldn't be killed, that are suffering just as much from ISIS as anybody is suffering from ISIS. A lot of people that are under the yoke of ISIS, and doing that indiscriminately is certainly going to raise more hatred. There's another problem, and that is any kind of warfare. There's a lot of this jingoistic talk about warfare today, and that we're at war. First of all, does that mean that ISIS is indeed a state? Usually you declare war against a state. You don't declare war against a group of guerrillas. You don't declare war against a group of thugs. You don't declare war against unless you're President Bush, you declare war on just about everything. So I think you have to be very careful with what you're saying, because otherwise you're defining it. You're defining what those people are.
Indeed, giving them almost the qualification that they're trying to impose by saying they are an Islamic State. It's actually almost giving them that. Can I pause you for a second and bring in our other guest who's going to obviously share the platter with you here? Iftikhar Malik is an expert on Islam and radicalization based at Bath Spa University. So I know I've only touched on a small area of your expertise, and I know you could correct me, but I'm asking you to bear with me and join our debate and spend the time talking about that. Can I put the question about Raqqa to you, sir? Do you feel bombing Raqqa is a mistake?
Good evening, and first of all, my condolences to people of France for this, great tragedy. I do feel that we have to change the strategy. I think we are in a vicious cycle, and it's like the reaction that the Americans showed under Bush administration in 9/11. And I think this is where the militants want all these Western states to get involved and to make it into a kind of vicious cycle, and to make this premise, dangerous premise of clash of civilization a reality. So my feeling is that we need to get out of this cycle, and the states have to sit down and they have to use some kind of multidimensional strategy where they could isolate these militants from the majority population. Because if we are going to go for such kind of vengeful operations, they may, sound very, very gung-ho for the moment, but in the long run, they will create more martyrs, and they will generate more grievances. And this is what groups like Islamic State want, that more and more people, marginalized people, should join their cause. So my feeling is that I could understand the reason for this reaction. It sounds very much expedient politically for the French president, but I think it fails the purpose of isolating these elements from the vast majorities whose hearts and minds are, of course, with the French people, or with those people, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslims, who are getting killed every day for no reason whatsoever. So my feeling is that we need to change the strategy. We need to make it more multilateral. We need to use the moral force. We need to use maybe clerical, scholarly groups, intellectuals in the Muslim world to speak out against such kind of policies. And most of all, I think there are political issues, and our efforts should be towards resolving those issues, whether they are Palestinian, Israeli issues, or there are the Kurdish issues, or there are issues of different nation states, or borders, or divided ethnicities. I think we have to show a kind of positive and proactive attitudes to these issues rather than simply reacting, because this is what we have been doing over the last 15 years in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and now in Syria.
Iftikhar, I'm getting a message of inclusion. I'm getting a message of trying to bring people into the equation rather than keeping them on the outside of it. Let me bring in Michael Kirtley for his reaction here in the studio. Michael.
Well, I think that, and I appreciate our last guest saying what has gone wrong over the past 15 years. It's obvious that every time that we've intervened, things have gotten worse. So why would we continue? That's like going insane to continue doing the same thing. And
that's how it looks, isn't it?
And expect for something to change. We attack Al-Qaeda, which was a normal reaction after 9/11. We diminish Al-Qaeda to a certain degree, and then it spawns these different groups, one of them being ISIS. ISIS is now stronger in many ways than Al-Qaeda ever was. It has land, it has money, it has the ability to recruit. So I'd say let's get off this bandwagon. I mean, what's the point? I mean, what is the point? And it seems to me that the point is we need to think really strategically in the same way that ISIS thinks strategically. In other words, what's the purpose for this terrorist attack that just took place, or any terrorist attack in general? The first purpose is publicity, is to show we have power. They know that by killing 120 people in the streets of Paris, they're not going to bring down their French government. And they know that they can't sustain that over a long period of time. They can do it episodically. Okay? But the second purpose, and this is very important, is to divide people. In other words, the greatest friend of ISIS is Islamophobia. You know, the more that our society is divided by creating this amalgam between Muslims and something that's going on that's called ISIS, the more ISIS wins. So if we're going to think strategically, we need to think in terms of communication as well as in terms of aspects like military engagement, probably special forces, as well as containment in terms of finance, the financial containment of that area and things like that. We need to think in terms of communication. ISIS communicates very well about its values. That we can disagree with their values, but we know that they're doing a good job because they're recruiting all of these people. They're changing minds. How do we in the West communicate about our values? Is there any effort to say, why is it important to be from the Western world? Why is it important to be from a so-called civilized society? I saw a kind of almost a parody of that as a meme the other day, where they were yesterday saying, well, we have drinking, we have dancing, we have, it's sort of frivolous things, which are, of course, part of our society and should be. But where are the main values? And I think as long as we can understand what we stand for, it's a lot easier to communicate to any group.
I think the very fact that you and I and Iftikhar are talking about this in our studio very openly shows exactly what is the point of Western society, the fact that people can debate, can talk, and freely exchange their views. Let me bring Iftikhar back in briefly. Iftikhar Malik joining us from the UK. In terms of bringing people back in, those people who feel on the outside of society, the people who are brought in to or pulled into, sucked into radicalization, there's no easy solution. You've talked in your first answer about maybe one or two ideas, but what is the solution there? Is it education? Is it jobs? Is it more benefits? What is the solution?
I think largely these are younger people. I mean, one aspect of this whole issue is related with Middle East and, that part of the world. The other issue is that there are these young people of Muslim background in Britain, in France and several other places, and they have all kind of issues of identity and maybe economic, maybe social, maybe we are too much focused on them, maybe they feel that Muslims are being singled out and the policies that these governments are formulating are only exceptionally focused on Muslims. So I think we have to reassure these people that they are equal citizens, they have their due rights, and this is not a war against Islam. This is not a discriminatory kind of orientation against Muslims in Europe. I think at one level, we have to create this bridge between the majorities and the minorities. And number two, I think we need to look at the models that we follow. In Britain, we call it multiculturalism. And in France, you call it assimilation. And my feeling is that both these models, despite all the good features they have certain issues. I mean, we saw bombing here in 2005, and they were all homegrown bombers, militants. And you have been seeing this in France. I mean, it happened twice this year, and these are mostly young people who were born in Europe or who were born in France in most cases. So I think we have to look at the younger people. Is it an issue of identity? Is it an issue of class? Is it an issue of geopolitics, where our foreign policies are creating lots of anxiety in the world outside and amongst the Muslim people here? I think after Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, lots of young people, lots of young Muslims in Europe and America are very angry. And I think the states, by passing all kinds of laws, legislation, have further pushed these people, some of these people, towards kind of political version of Islam. And I think we need to look at our policies and we need to look at a relationship between the state and the minority, Muslim minorities especially. So I think these are all kind of sociological issues. And this is where I think the issues of the Muslim world find some kind of convergence with the issues of these young marginalized Muslims in Britain, in France, in Belgium, and several other places.
Indeed, as you point out, Iftikhar, it is a minority of people who are involved in this, but a very dangerous minority. Michael, I know there were certain aspects that you were taking issue with.
Well, I think we have to be very careful to give the impression that just because people feel disaffected, that they're suddenly going to become radicalized. Most young people around the world are disaffected in some form or another. This particular group of immigrants that gets disaffected is disaffected partly because they're excluded in some ways or another. But it would be if we started thinking in this way, we would think that every young Muslim was a potential radical, which is totally wrong. This is a very wrong way of thinking. Most young people, whether they're Muslim or whether they're not Muslim, most young people, whether they're French or whether they're Moroccan or whether they're Egyptian, want to live the good life. Okay? That's what they want. Most people from the Islamic and the Arab world see some values in their own culture, but they also see some values in the European culture. You know these people. I know these people. Let's not fool ourselves. If we start thinking of Muslims as being a group that hates the West, not only is that erroneous, it's dangerous.
Can I point out that we've had many messages here at France 24 from Muslim people saying, I'm a Muslim, I've got nothing to do with these attacks. It isn't something that I share. I don't share their values. I don't share their aims, and I'm nothing to do with Islamic State. And that's something we've been keen to tell people watching our programming since the Paris attacks that is the case. And I think what you're saying is completely correct, Michael. Let me bring in Iftikhar again for another comment. I mean, clearly, Iftikhar, there are people who are isolated and feel that they have a grudge against society. Somehow they're getting pulled into this Islamist extremism. Now, how does that happen, sir? Do you have any real clues as to how that happens? What is the one thing that tips them over the edge? Or it's, I imagine, not one thing. It's a catalogue of things. But why does it happen? Can you give us some clues as to that?
I think victimhood doesn't take any community anywhere. And I don't think Muslims should live in this state of victimhood. But there are some grievances that the Muslims have. I mean, look at all these 4 or 5 states that I mentioned. I mean, West has fought the longest war in its history in Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries on earth. And not a single Afghan was involved in 9/11. We should have isolated Taliban from Al-Qaeda. But we all put them together, we attacked that country, we spent trillions of dollars, and see where we are. Now, same American government wants to have negotiations between the Kabul government and Taliban. So what I'm saying is that maybe we need to relook at our policies where, and maybe learn a lesson, from where we have gone wrong. Number 2, I think there are memories. Many people think that West has been a colonial power and it controlled most of the Muslim world, which means Britain and France and to some extent Holland, and a little bit of, a colonial history of Italy, but mostly Britain and France. And then after independence, the influence of these countries, along with that of the United States, has been generally seen very partisan. But I come back to the point that Michael raised, that there are lots of people in the developing world, including the Muslim world, who adore the West. They want to migrate to the West for better living standards, better educational institutions, a greater sense of security, and equality before law. So we should not forget that there are lots of people, and vast majority of the Muslims, who adore Western institutions. I think there is some problem, some time for some people regarding the policies, the foreign policies of the Western government. And now with the raft of policies focusing on Muslims, I mean, we read about these young kids being reported by their teachers to the police or to welfare agencies that they have tendencies to become radical. I think we have become oversensitive. And number two, the states, the governments becoming nanny states. How should we dress? How should we look? Are we feeling threatened by few people if they wear turban, or if they wear a kippah, or if the women are wearing hijab or niqab? I think states should go beyond that, and they should have a sense of security, and they should have a sense of history on their side.
You're talking there about the difference, I think, between Britain and France. There is a definite difference in approach, but nonetheless, Britain also remains very much in the crosshairs of Islamic State.
No, I'm not idealizing any situation. What I'm saying is that the states have to relax, and they have to look back at the policies, whether these are policies vis-a-vis the Muslim world, or these are the policies about minorities such as Muslims. And I think there is quite a bit of space where we could be very innovative rather than being reactive. And this is where I think that we have to make these young people, coming back to your earlier question, we have to make these young men and women into stakeholders of a system, wherever they are, in their new homes. There is no going back, actually.
So it's about empowering people. It's about making people feel part of it, belonging.
Vast majority of these Muslims are not immigrants. They are local born. More than 70% of them they grew up here in Britain. In case of France, there is a longer tradition. That's what I can't understand, because if you look at the idea of deprivation, being brought up on unemployment with very little money, with few prospects. I mean, my own childhood was like that. I didn't turn to the kind of crimes that some people might have turned to, let alone to something as extreme as terrorism. You know, there must be other things at play, surely. Yeah, I mean, there's no single explanation. But of course, that's why we need lots of strategies.
Let me bring in Michael Iftikhar. Let me pause you for a second. Sorry, Michael.
To use that example that you just gave about your own childhood, I think that it's a very interesting way to think about this. If you look into the background of most of these kids that have been radicalized, we always find out that they were petty criminals at some point in their adolescence or in their young adulthood. In the past, such petty criminals have easily ended up with the mafiosi, for example, have easily ended up with gangs, have easily ended up in groups that help them define their identity. Okay, in this particular situation, those same young people are still, like any young people, looking for some sort of identity, looking for some meaning to their lives when their own lives themselves are not particularly attractive. And pops onto the scene this supranational group called ISIS that presents them with an appetizing thought that somehow they can be bigger than themselves. They can somehow create a state. Think about that, create a state. They can be part of the creation of a dynamic movement. I don't think it's much about Islam, frankly. I think it's much more about wanting to belong. And in that sense, ISIS has the characteristics, the psychological characteristics, much more of a cult than it does of a movement or of a religion.
It's about kudos, it's about belonging, it's about manipulation,
and I think that if we don't think that way, if we don't understand, first of all, we have to define who is the enemy. What is the enemy? Okay? I don't think this is very well defined by our leaders today. What is the enemy? Is it a group called ISIS? If that's the case, then what about these terrorists in the street the other day? Most of them claim some allegiance to ISIS, but they're definitely not ISIS. Okay, they're people from the suburbs of Paris who decided to get together in some name and come, and they themselves didn't claim it in the name of ISIS.
Just going back to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, for instance, there had one group, the Khaoshi brothers, who attacked Charlie Hebdo, claiming they did it for Al Qaeda. Then you had Koulibaly, who killed the people at the Jewish
and I think
supermarket, saying he did it for ISIS.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's this kind of association thing.
These claims are really bogus. In other words, this gives a pretext. And I think until we understand that, we need to take away that pretext. Number one. Okay, we need to think intelligently about removing this pretext that they can take. The first thing you do is disinformation. You destroy the possibility. I mean, I don't know if you noticed today, but Anonymous, the international hacker group, came out and said they were going to do everything to destroy ISIS through disinformation. I think that's a very good idea. We need to do more and more of this. It's the same tactics we would use in any kind of warfare. The second thing is we need to show how silly they are. Our friend mentioned bringing in imams and other. Keep in mind that the Muslim world most of the Muslim world doesn't identify with ISIS. Okay, so that's a kind of a tricky thing. And which Muslims are representing the Muslim world? So Islam is not so hierarchical that you can actually take an imam here that's going to be recognized as an important imam over there.
Iftikhar, can I bring you back in to ask about the thing that struck me is the eyewitnesses who saw the atrocities, who survived, talked about young men, some of them looking like kids, basically. That is disturbing. I'm sure you agree. One of the disturbing aspects about this is the manipulation of young minds.
You're very right. And I think whether I look at Afghanistan or I look at Iraq or Syria, I think these are lots of young people. In Pakistan, many people who subscribe to the ideology of Pakistani Taliban, they happen to be young people. But then there's a group of people who are very well educated. They're very much educated. I mean, don't forget Osama bin Laden studied here, and 17 of those Saudi perpetrators of 9/11, they came from prosperous families. They were rich kids, and they had been studying in the United States. So there are two kinds of people that you come across. Of course, they are mostly young people. Mostly they are disgruntled. Maybe they have personal issues. Maybe they are very much politicized. But at the same time, there are people who are poor, who have fallen out of the safety net, like Taliban, let's say, in Afghanistan, some groups. And then there are well-off Muslims who are supporting such kind of movements. So I think we need to differentiate. Number two, I think two major events we got to look at. Number one, it was Iran, where a revolution took place in 1979. And a powerful, leader, the Shah of Iran, he had to leave the country. And ordinary masses, led by these ayatollahs, they brought about this revolution, this major change, like revolution in your country. That encouraged lots of Muslims from bazaars, Muslims from lower, classes, that they can bring about a change. The second major event happened in the same year, 79, December, when the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, attacked Afghanistan. They thought they would just walk in and they'll be able to control this third world country. But the Afghans put up the resistance. Before anybody else came in to support them, whether it was United States or Pakistan or France or Britain or Saudi Arabia, the Afghans were fighting the Soviets. And eventually Soviets had to withdraw from Afghanistan. Not only they withdrew from Afghanistan, Soviet Union was dissolved. So those two events created a sense of what you call triumphalism, that if these people get together, they can push these countries back, and powerful countries, especially the superpower, the former superpower, Soviet Union.
Iftikhar Malik, I'm afraid I have to cut you off because we're out of time now, but thank you so very much for your analysis and sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate your time as well. And Michael Kirtley here in the studio, as ever. Pleasure to see you, sir, and thank you very much for talking to us.